If we're going to talk about Jesus, we have to understand our relationship to who and what Jesus represents and who and what Jesus was calling us to know about ourselves. And so as we are in this series, Who is Jesus to Me? We started last week, which was Easter, and my topic was Reimagine Easter. It was actually inspired by the theme for our very first service when we opened the doors of CSC, recognizing that we need to look at the Easter story differently and understand that it's actually a part of ourselves. And so this idea that the Christ lives within us, and actually we can find the correspondence. We find the correspondence in the Son. We watch the path of the Son, which mirrors this wonderful story of the path of Jesus. And then similarly, that same story is being played out in our lives over and over again, just as the Son dies in winter and goes down into the southern hemisphere into darkness, but then rises again in the vernal equinox of spring. So we recognize that we have experienced dying and resurrecting over and over in our lives. Even at the simplest level, it mirrors how we move from childhood to being a teenager, to being a young adult, to being full-grown adults. We actually die to an old way of being and are resurrected into a new way of being. Yes, yes. And so if we look at the Easter story, we have to reimagine it and understand that it's really talking about us. Now, as I already said before we just sang the song, Same Power, we are in this place and space of remembrance. There were a lot of different programs that were on. Of course, PBS had a few things on remembering Dr. Martin Luther King, and particularly remembering and looking at the last days of his life. And even in some cases, you can find documentaries that look at the last year of his life, which was a very radical and revolutionary year for him in many ways. But we know that he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, 50 years ago. Many of us were not here at that time, or we were babies at that time. We became beneficiaries of so much of the work that he did. Yes, yes? And so much of the work that he was able to bring forth together through the movement. Now, we also remember that the night before he was killed, he said some very stirring words. It's one of his most amazing sermons to me as a minister, and just the way he riffs on the if I had sneezed. If you've heard it, you recognize that he was stabbed and had to receive surgery. And it was said that if he had just sneezed, the blade would have tore into his heart and would have killed him. He would have bled to death. And a young girl who was in the 9th grade at that time wrote him a letter and said, "Dr. King, I'm so glad you didn't sneeze." And he went on to say, "If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here to watch the march in Selma and us march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And if I had sneezed," I just love that, right? Just good preaching. But there's something else that he says, and of course, as he ends this, what was really a very, very extemporaneous and spontaneous message that he gave, because he didn't plan on being there to speak to the group of people that were assembled at the church that night. He said, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." His very last words were incredibly prophetic, of course, because he is and was a prophet. And when I hear that idea of we as a people, although he was speaking to a crowd there in Memphis in 1968, I know that he was speaking also collectively to humanity, as he was all about and focused on creating this beloved community, the beloved community that is exemplified in the words of the "I Have a Dream" speech. He was speaking to all of us, regardless of what area of the world we were born in or we live in, regardless of what we look like, regardless of what our sexual orientation may be. It doesn't matter. This we and this promised land is for all of us. And it reminded me, as I was thinking about the path of the Christ and thinking about Martin Luther King, of course, it took me to Joseph Campbell, where he talks about the hero's journey. And he talks about heroes in this conversation in The Power of Myth with Bill Moyers. And he simply says, a hero properly is someone who has given his life to something bigger than himself or other than himself. And this, of course, we can think about Dr. King, and we have to say, he indeed is and was a hero, because he, of course, gave his life to something bigger than himself, the movement, to humanity. right? On the world stage, he was recognized, and he gave himself up to something other than himself. Because what's interesting, if you consider that he was well-educated and could have easily been the pastor of a congregation and lived life that way. He did not have to actually engage in the movement. He gave himself up to something other than himself and bigger than himself. It reminds me then of the words of Jesus in John 15:13, where Jesus writes or says, it's put in the mouth of Jesus, "No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." And so we see this similar idea that this is what the hero says. This is what the hero is talking about. This idea of giving themselves to something other than themselves or something bigger than themselves. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to give of your life. Doesn't mean that you have to be sacrificed and die on a cross. It doesn't mean any of that. But it is the recognition that the hero is always giving of herself or himself in some way. And so as we look at where we are in history, we're in some pretty revolutionary times, yes, yes? I mean, we can just quickly look to the Me Too movement and say we are in revolutionary times. We can quickly look at the March for Our Lives and the power of the young people as they're taking a stand in this nation and across the planet. And we would say that we are definitely in revolutionary times. Yes, yes. There's no doubt about it that the history books, we will look back on this time as a marker of an ushering of a new age and a new day. And it reminded me in my study, and I believe this was a conversation, an interview I was listening to Angela Davis, an interview that she gave back in the 60s, and she was talking about the idea of revolution and talking about the fact that there, of course, have always been multiple revolutions within the United States, and she juxtaposed the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement at that time as the third revolution. She says, we had the American Revolution, right, which, of course, we know ushered in a new time and a new age. And then after the American Revolution, the next great revolution in this country was the Civil War, right? And then after the Civil War, this third revolution was the movement that happened in the 60s. Not just the civil rights movement, but we also know that women's rights and women's empowerment came out of that time. We also know that was the anti-war movement that happened at that time. And we know that young people, similar to the way that young people are standing now, were standing at that time. It was another revolution. And so I believe that we are in the next revolution. But if we are in the next revolution, then what I want us to understand is how we need to stand and how we need to operate in this next revolution. And in order to do that, I thought it would be appropriate to look at the life of Jesus, because if we're asking this question, who is Jesus to me, then there is something that we can learn from the radical revolutionary nature of who and what Jesus is. Did you know that Jesus is a radical revolutionary? Jesus spoke truth to power, literally. Jesus broke rules all the time that didn't make any sense. Civil disobedience. If you want to understand what civil disobedience is, well, read Thoreau, right? Wonderful essay on civil disobedience. But then also look at the life of Jesus, because he was a radical revolutionary. And so if we are going to understand how to operate in this next revolution, there's one word that I want us to focus on today, a word that seems antithetical to revolution: compassion. In order to operate effectively in this next revolution, we must understand, embrace, and embody compassion. Now, to talk about this word, I want to go to one of my favorite New Testament scholars, Marcus Borg. In his book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, The Historical Jesus and the Heart of Contemporary Faith, he talks about this idea of compassion and Jesus and how compassion was central to his revolutionary nature and what he was actually doing in what we receive in the Gospels. So the first thing is, it's interesting because this word compassion we find over and over again. If you look in the book of Matthew, and I want to share a couple verses here, short verses, we find the word compassion over and over again. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion and then cured their sick. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for the crowd, because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, for they might faint on the way. Another verse. Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes. Immediately, they regained their sight and followed him. Something very interesting. The word compassion comes before every miracle. And he had compassion for them, and he cured the sick. I have compassion for the crowd, and so then he fed the multitudes. Miracle. Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes, and immediately they regained their sight and followed him. Compassion is not only required to be a radical revolutionary, but compassion is what's required to be a miracle on the earth, or a miracle worker on the earth. Now, the other thing I love in the recounting of the story of the prodigal son, which is, I love to talk about this. When Jesus is speaking and teaching from the parables, he always says the kingdom of heaven is like this. And then he'll tell a story, sometimes a short story. And he usually does not give the meaning of the story except to the disciples. I shared that last week where in secret, when the disciples asked the meaning, then he shared the meaning with them. And so in the book of Luke, and we only find this in the Gospel of Luke, when he's telling the story of the prodigal son, we know that the prodigal son, he wanted his inheritance, he took his inheritance, he squandered it, and then he came to himself, as the story says, because he was there with the pigs and the slop, and he said, even my father's servants have more than enough, and he decides to turn back to go home. And so we're in this point of the story. So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. There's that compassion word again. Jesus is telling this story and using this word compassion because it's one of his favorite things, right? It's how he operates. And as he's teaching how the kingdom works, the kingdom of heaven, which is within you, Jesus said that, then we recognize that we have to understand what compassion is all about. And so then we have in Luke 6:38, we have a verse that is generally mistranslated. And if you look in most versions, even the New Revised Standard Version, which is the version that I recommend, but of course the King James Version, what we read in Luke is, be merciful as God is merciful. And this is what Jesus was saying. Jesus doesn't give many commandments, right? But this is something that he said, do this. But as we study and look to, and I'm going to share what Marcus Borg has to say about this, when we look at this, the better translation, and this would be from the New English Bible or the Jerusalem Bible, is be compassionate as God is compassionate. This was something that Jesus embodied at every level of his being and was demonstrating this and then commanding or advising the disciples to operate in the same way, understanding that if we are one with God, then in order to embody or to exemplify the attributes of this creator that we are one with, we must be like it, compassionate. And so in the text, Marcus Borg writes this. In Hebrew, as well as in Aramaic, the word usually translated as compassion is the plural of the noun that in its singular form means womb. In the Hebrew Bible, compassion is both a feeling and a way of being that flows out of that feeling. Compassion, it's the plural noun of the singular word womb. And so again, this is different than what we have translated so often as mercy or merciful. Because what we recognize when mercy or merciful is invoked, then it gives us this idea of being better than. It creates this idea of hierarchy, and it creates this idea of separation. It's the difference between serving and helping, right? If you're helping somebody, then you're bending down as though they are lowly and not enough. But when you're serving someone, you're serving them because they are equal to you, even though they may be in a need. And so we recognize that if the truth of this word, the Hebrew and Aramaic is compassionate, then we need to dig a little deeper into understanding what that means. And so Marcus Borg takes us to the English etymology of compassion. Compassion means to feel with. As even the etymology of the English word suggests, passion comes from the Latin word that means to feel, and the prefix com means with. Compassion thus means feeling the feelings of somebody else in a visceral way at a level somewhere below the level of the head. Most commonly, compassion is associated with feeling the suffering of somebody else, and being moved by that suffering to do something. That is the feeling of compassion. That is, the feeling of compassion leads to being compassionate. So to feel with, and I love this because when we go through the Easter story, and particularly talking about the crucifixion, it's called the Passion of Christ, which is then passion meaning the suffering of Christ. And so then compassion is most oftenly talked about as to suffer with, right? But I love looking deeper into the word that it's to feel with. And the reason why I love to feel with, because this brings us back to this idea that we are one with each other, that we are actually aspects of one body, that is the body of God. And each of us are individualized expressions of that thing, but yet we have an individual life. Just as the cells, the trillions of cells in your body have an individual awareness and an individual experience, and yet they are one with you because you are the total body, right? And so as we recognize this, then to be compassionate, to operate as a radical revolutionary, it is important that we can invoke this power of compassion, because if we cannot feel with our brothers and sisters in Syria, if we cannot feel with our brothers and sisters that are being killed unarmed for no apparent reason, if we cannot feel with the women that are being that are feeling scared as they are in the workplace, or have to do something different, or try to dress a certain way so that they won't be attacked, if we cannot feel with, how can we bring about change? How can we be radical revolutionaries? So it is important that we understand this oneness that we have. The oneness that you have. And so then we dig a little deeper, because as I shared earlier, what does Marcus Borg say? He says that compassion is the plural of the noun that in its singular form means womb. And this is when we get into some good stuff. God is like a womb. Because remember, be compassionate as God is compassionate. In other words, the way we could say that is be like a womb as God is like a womb. And so he writes this: like a womb, God is the one who gives birth to us, the mother who gives birth to us. As a mother loves the children of her womb and feels for the children of her womb, so God loves us and feels for us, for all of her children, in the sense of like a womb. Compassionate has its nuances of giving life, nourishing, caring, perhaps embracing and encompassing. For Jesus, this is what God is like. Be compassionate as God is compassionate. Be like a womb as God is like a womb. And this is where we get into, was it last month, in healing your God trauma. I talked about this idea that it's there in the text, but if we don't have the proper translations, we don't see this idea of God and understanding the mother principle or the feminine principle that is inherent in who and what God is, which is why we invoke in all of our prayers, Mother, Father, God. And so then if we just dig a little deeper, understanding and thinking about the radical revolutionary nature of Jesus and this next revolution that we are all a part of and that we are being asked to move through, if we are being asked to be like a womb, like God is like a womb, oh my goodness, how do we have to stand in this world? As we recognize that compassion has nuances of giving life, as Marcus Borg writes, nourishing, caring, perhaps embracing and encompassing. What does revolution look like when we think about giving life? I talked about it over the past few weeks as we're watching the young people that are taking a stand. Well, it's important for us to be the womb for them. Yes, yes. It's important for us to be compassionate, to actually create space within ourselves, right? Something that wasn't within, oh my God, this metaphor of the woman. If you understand something that wasn't a part of you, to allow another being to inhabit your being, because you recognize that if you give of yourself for 9 months, you give of yourself, and in nourishing that thing, and nourishing that child and nourishing that life, you give birth to something that multiplies you and has the ability and has the capacity to change the entire planet. Be compassionate. Be like a womb as God is like a womb. So then we ask ourselves, if we want to be revolutionaries on this planet, in this nation, is there are things that we need to get radical about? Yes, yes. There are things that we recognize that we need to call on a revolution about, and this does not mean taking up arms. It simply means it's time for a change. We recognize that if we get the opportunity to be like a womb, for some of us it may be to be that person that is healing and caring and working with the mothers of the sons who are being shot. Or to work with our communities as communities in totality are feeling scared and not knowing how we can move forward. It means for others, some of us need to be like a womb with the police departments. Because what I know to be true, and Pastor Yolanda, we've been talking about this in different ways, but what I know to be true, if we understand something about how stress works. Now, we understand, something that's very profound, that stress is the root cause of the top 5 killers of humans or adults in this country, right? If we go back to heart issues, the root of heart issues is stress, right? And what I know to be true is that when we're stressed out, as we now understand how the brain operates, when we're stressed out, what does it mean? We are operating from the amygdala, this part of the head. It's the most ancient part of ourselves. And it's that part, it's the fight or flight part of ourselves. It's the part of ourselves that we need to access if you were crossing the street and you had the right of way and a car just starts zooming down towards you, right? That fight or flight, all of the adrenaline would rush into your body and you would dash across the street easily and effortlessly. But because as humanity, most people are so stressed out, we are actually walking around with cortisol pumping through our veins and adrenaline pumping through our veins on a daily basis, living in that fight or flight place. Now, at its extreme, we've seen people that you look like if you just say hello, they'll cuss you out, right? That's what being stressed out is. Now, what's interesting, though, when we're not stressed, then we have access to our entire brain. I love how Bob Roth talks about it, the executive director of the David Lynch Foundation. He says that this prefrontal cortex is the CEO of the mind. And so what happens is then those that are stressed out never have access to the CEO. The CEO isn't able to communicate, isn't able to delegate, isn't able to lead or guide in any way. And so what I recognize is the only way someone could misconstrue a cell phone for a gun is if they're in that fight or flight place. They're so stressed out that they can't even see straight. And let's think about our own lives. I know I've done it. In a place where if I'm stressed or I'm angry and I'm in this place, I can't actually access logic. I can't access reasonable thought. I start to see things that aren't really there. I start to imagine things or hear things that aren't. You ever been in an argument and you thought somebody said something and that's not even what they said? Right? And so let's just blow this out on this larger scale when we understand all of the lies that are perpetuated that you're supposed to be scared of black men. When you start to push out all the things, even, and this is why I love The Wire and David Simon, when you understand even what's happening in the police departments, the stress of trying to make all these numbers and making up numbers, and right, you recognize all of these things that are going on, and then we understand why some officers will see a wallet and fear for their lives. And so maybe for some of us, we get to be like a womb. I've already reached out and I've talked to the Transcendental Meditation Center to find out what work is being done. And there actually is some new work that's being done to reach out to cops. I know that there's some mindfulness practices that have been happening and some beautiful things. We've seen that in Canada. Actually, cops meditate before they go out each day. And so maybe for some of us, we may want to be a part of that change, to be like a womb, to be able to hold space, to allow this fetus, it's a new idea that has been conceived within us, and to be able to hold it and allow it, nourish it, and then allow it to come forth through us so that then it becomes a full-grown human being. And it multiplies itself, and it multiplies itself, and it multiplies itself. And so in closing, as I was thinking about this idea of the next revolution, my mind was taken to a very famous song by the Beatles. As we talk about this time of revolution that came forth in the 60s, what was so beautiful about the 60s is there was a sound of revolution as well. I'm still looking for the sound of revolution. All of our artists that are out there, artists are our prophets, but for some reason they've lost their prophetic voice. And so we have this song from the Beatles that unfortunately for myself, because I wasn't around during those times, this song was introduced to me, and I'm sure many of you remember when Nike used the song for their commercial back in the day? This is when it became popular all over again. But there's something powerful that they say here. You say you want a revolution, of course. Well, we all want to change the world. But then they go on, they say, you say you'll change the Constitution. Well, you know, we all want to change your head. You tell me it's the institution. Well, you know, you better free your mind instead. The next revolution starts with us. And so if we understand that compassion is required, to be like God, to be compassionate as God is compassionate, to be like a womb, like God is like a womb, that means we got to free our minds. That means we have to free our thoughts. And so the next revolution requires compassion. Compassion as Jesus embodied and understood, compassion as God is. As we read the miracles of Jesus over and over, he was moved by compassion, with compassion, with compassion. Understanding that he wasn't looking down on anyone, but he was seeing the oneness of that person that couldn't see. He was seeing his oneness with that person that couldn't walk. He was seeing and knowing his oneness with that person that was hungry. He was seeing and knowing his oneness with that person that was scared. He was seeing and knowing his oneness with that person that was pushed on the fringes of society. He was seeing and knowing his oneness with those people that were considered different than everybody else, and so God couldn't love them. He was seeing his oneness with someone who needed to be healed on Sunday, but everybody said you ain't supposed to heal nobody on Sunday. He was seeing his oneness. He was feeling with. And out of that compassion, then inevitably, he could not help himself but to be compassionate. As we stand, I bring us back to the words of Joseph Campbell. A hero properly understood is someone who has given her life to something bigger than herself or other than herself. This is what mothers do and have done over and over and over again. A mother gives of her body to something bigger and greater than herself, to the miracle of life. And so as we are in this revolutionary era, this revolutionary stage in this nation and globally, because there's so many things that we can focus on, pick whatever thing is your thing. We're in the season of the earth right now, and we're sending love to the planet through our meditation, and we're going to honor Earth Day this month. And so climate change may be the thing that you're focused on. As I am working day in and day out with Witness and human rights, we're looking at human rights all over the planet in every region. Recognize that even climate change is a human rights issue. For some, it may be working to change the laws around guns in this planet. Thank you to the state of California that is now leading with legislation that will start to bring forth some changes. And not only just the gun violence in the sense of mass shootings, but the assassination of our black boys. The world is calling on your compassion. Pick an area. Pick the area that resonates with you and be the hero. In the proper sense of being a hero. Being a mother. Being like a womb, as God is like a womb. And so we take a deep breath in and we release. We breathe in and we breathe out. Mother, mother, mother. We stand here now knowing who and what you are. And we hear the words, we hear the commandment of our elder brother Jesus saying, be like God. God is like a womb. Be compassionate. God is compassionate. Open up your heart, your mind, your very self, and give of yourself to something bigger and something greater than you. Be willing to give of yourself, to give birth to something, to give birth to a new idea, to give birth to a new way of seeing, to give birth to a new way of living on the earth. Open up your very heart and your very mind right here and right now. and be part of this revolution. I am so grateful and thankful for the example and the ministry of Jesus the Christ. I am so grateful and thankful for the example and the ministry of Dr. Martin Luther King. I am so grateful and thankful for the example and the ministry of the young people that are standing up through the March for Our Lives. I am so grateful for the example and the ministry of the women that are standing up right here and right now saying me too, for the women that are standing up right here and right now and saying time's up. I am so grateful. I am so thankful for the ministry and example of the Black Lives Matter movement. I am so grateful. I am so thankful for the climate change movement that is reminding us that the science is real. And so we stand and we feel with all of the souls that have aligned to bring about change and revolution on the planet. And what we know to be true is that this movement and this momentum is inevitable. No longer do we look to the day-to-day effects of what seems to be happening or not happening. But what we know is that there's a snowball of truth and there's a snowball of change that is rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling down the hill. So while we know and we recognize that we are seeking to make a change in the White House, we do not get so disturbed by the foolishness that's happening in the White House, because this is just a blip on the timeline of revolution. This is just a blip on the timeline of change. This is just a blip. It is just something that has caused many of us to wake up. It is something that has caused and awakened many of us to realize that we need to take a stand, that we need to speak out, that we need to speak up, that we need to stand with our immigrant brothers and sisters. Mother, Father, God, I am so grateful and thankful to know that you are compassionate, to know that you are our mother, and to know that each and every one of us come from your womb. And as we recognize the truth as above, so below, then here on this plane, each and every one of us has a womb energetically, spiritually. And we are choosing now to freely allow ourselves to hold the ideas of change, to hold the ideas of freedom, to hold the ideas of harmony, to hold the ideas of unity, to hold the ideas of abundance and more than enough for all, to hold the ideas of no one being hungry, to hold the ideas of everyone being able to go to school and in safety, and hold the ideas of everyone being able to go to college for free, and hold the ideas of there being no more debt, and holding the ideas of financial freedom, and holding the ideas. We freely allow ourselves and give of ourselves to hold these ideas, because a womb is required for anything new to be birthed. Freely we say yes. Freely we say, here I am. Use me, use me, use me. For this truth, I am so very grateful. I release this prayer now with joy and thanksgiving. I release it back into the law, this law that is always in operation, this law that hears me, this law that is organizing itself around the words that have been spoken in this space right here and right now. And together we lift up our voices and we say, amen, ashe. And so it is. And so it is. Thank you, God.